Thanks for tuning in to the Replatform podcast sponsored by Amplience and Klaviyo. It's myself, James Gurd, and my co-host, Paul Rogers. How's it going, buddy?
Yeah, good. Thanks. As I was saying a minute ago, pretty caffeinated this morning, but yeah, good. How are you doing?
Excellent. So totally wired for this podcast. You're in New York, aren't you? Are you having fun?
Yeah, it's good. Yeah, the weather's unreal. I'm very pleasantly surprised.
Lucky you. Well, I'm in downcast, grey, miserable England today, but we're going to cheer everyone up with a exciting and useful podcast. So thanks to everyone who's a regular listener who's tuning back in, and a warm welcome if this is the first time you've joined us. We hope you like it. Do subscribe to get regular alerts, and we'd love a like on YouTube, Spotify and Apple. Right, so our topic today is what does good project communication look like for e-commerce projects and specifically replatforming. What we're going to cover is what are the risks of poor comms, the stakeholder groups you need to plan for, proven techniques, and tooling, the importance of not just relying on emails for communication. So I guess let's start with the basics. Like, what are the risks of not doing this? So if I give my thoughts, Paul, then you let us know from your experience, what have you seen happen when there's poor comms? So the main thing for me is you need to get all your key stakeholders on board and participating and sharing in the project success from the start to help you as a project owner or sponsor or PM to get the best delivery. If you don't communicate effectively, then you find that some people aren't on board, they don't prioritize their time, and it gets really, really hard to get them to do what you want when you really need to, and especially when you need them to do things at short notice. If they don't feel like you've taken the time to give them the respect they deserve, you're unlikely to get it back from them when you really need it. You've got to get people on the side, and you do that through really clear communication and setting expectations. And the other thing is that if you don't communicate clearly, people can go off and do things they think are right, but aren't actually what the project needs. And that can cause inefficiency and it can slow you down. And then it can also really, really wind them up, because if they think they're contributing, but you then tell them what they've done is wrong, they've wasted that time and it is a bit jarring. So I think those for me are the two key risks. What have you seen? What are the risks if people don't communicate properly?
Yeah, I think, the ones you've just mentioned are really important. I think the other one is, I think if people don't give people enough notice, it's for tasks or any kind of expectations around their involvement, I think people will typically or can end up being quite negative about the project, and that seems to kind of grow. And I think some of the biggest things I've seen around launches and replatform project is you basically just need to avoid people being against the project or in any way negative, because it just spirals and ends up working its way up. And yeah, I think the key is, like you said, getting everyone bought in, but also just avoiding frustration, because I think that can impact kind of someone's impression of a project.
Yeah, the negative point is so important, and that's tied in, I think, as well with resource prioritization. If you don't engage the senior stakeholders who own the resource, so they are the team leaders, senior managers, if you don't show them the respect that they deserve as senior parts of the business, you sometimes find friction and even politics creeping in, where they're like, well, sod you didn't engage my part of the business, I'm not going to give my team's prior resource to you when you most need it. So there is a delicate balance out there. So with those risks identified, do you want to walk us through then? Who do you need to communicate with and why?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I feel like some of this stuff I'm a bit of a hypocrite with, because I do also think this is something I'm quite weak at, actually. And there's been a number of projects that I kind of operate in isolation. But I guess really you want to communicate with as many people as possible, even if you've got different levels, and it's kind of high level communication around the project and kind of what it means to the business. All of that stuff is really important. I think some of the ones that often get missed. So third-party agencies. So I've definitely seen a lot of projects where things like affiliate agencies or performance marketing agencies, or kind of niche, more display-focused agencies, for example, just don't know about the project. And then suddenly, just before launch, you're you need to re-add your pixels, or you need to pause campaigns, etc. And yeah, same principles apply. You can frustrate them, or it can just not get done, or you end up losing out on, you end up a couple of days without activity, etc. So that's an important one at the start of a project. I think it's important to list out those agencies and kind of get them bought in early. Obviously, internal stakeholders is a big one. I think customer services is one that often gets missed, and that's a really important one, because if you're replatforming, chances are you're probably gonna need people to reactivate accounts or reset passwords, all of that kind of stuff, and that will usually have an impact on customer services. And there's various other things like that impact customer services, and you might be switching technologies which can impact them, etc., etc. IT team's another one, and then I've got internal and external IT here. So like things like, you know, anything to do with the DNS needs to be communicated really early and planned in, and if you're outsourcing that kind of stuff, that can be a bit of a nightmare. And I've definitely seen that with projects in the past where, you know, people have given like 2 weeks notice to an IT team that are managing DNS or emails or whatever else, and, you know, if you're adding any other variables like changing domain name and all of that kind of stuff, that can be a bit annoying. Broader business comms, so just wider business. I think it's important to know, for the wider business, know that there is a replatforming project happening, what it means, etc., what the likely impacts of it are. And then the last one I've got down here is things like the 3PL. So that's another one that can go that can be missed, and like things like test orders, and, you know, just making sure that those teams are available. Like I did one recently and we didn't really involve the 3PL at all until quite near the end, and then we actually ended up needing them to like customize a few bits on there and for certain orders that are coming through. And it would have been much easier if we had notified them earlier, or they were kind of a bit more aware of the project. So I guess, long story short, as many people as possible, anyone that's kind of directly impacted by ecom.
I agree. I think people don't take enough time at the start to map this out, and it's classic. We're coming to the minute, like racy management. People are responsible, accountable. Those who are consulted or informed, but you need to know that people are involved. So I think it's really good. External is a classic one. I also think there are other sub audiences who don't need to have such regular communication, but you need to think about how you keep them informed and therefore enthused and believing that the decisions are being made correctly. And that's senior leadership team. So you'll have a sponsor, but that sponsor is part of a wider leadership team. What is the mechanism for communicating to those people and keeping it very simple? They don't want the detail. They don't want to hear about the agonizing you're having to do to fight all the little fires. They want to know key issues, risks, mitigations, fixes, resolutions, just high level dashboard summary stuff. So thinking through who they are and what you have to communicate and getting that agreed with your sponsor up front can take away a lot of headaches later on from people going, you're not communicating clearly enough. And the other one linked to that, people sometimes don't want to, but often you need to, are investors. Investors who have a keen financial interest in the success of the project, but also the budgetary control, making sure that you've got a very succinct process for how that goes up. And typically that is the sponsor's responsibility for ensuring that communication goes up through the board and into it. But you do have to think these through, because there's nothing worse as a project, an e-commerce lead on a project, suddenly having an investor trying to pull you aside or pull apart what you're doing that you're not expecting because it hasn't been thought through. So trying to think about all the potential objections you can have from different parts of the business if they're not communicated to is a good way of framing it, and then go, right, what do they need from me in order to keep them at bay so I can focus on my project? So let's talk about some proven techniques then to help achieve that. So the first ones on my mind always are a proper project briefing for internal teams. And this can be done in multiple ways. So for dispersed teams, it's far harder to do face-to-face, especially now that we've got genuine hybrid work in a lot of businesses where not the whole team aren't always in the office on the same days. It becomes very hard to do physical in-person meetings for everyone unless you run multiple ones, but that can create extra work and inefficiency. So finding a way and agreeing how you do the internal briefing. And that, number one, you've got to define the brief, which is what we're doing, why are we doing it, what's our scope, how are we going to run this, who's the project team, what are the key timelines, what are your roles, any questions, sort of thing. Those are the key elements of that briefing. But you do it, don't just send out a document. It's really impersonal. Get the face-to-face, whether it's on a video or it's in person. Give people a chance to question what's going on, ask you how it's going to go, anything they're not sure about, if they didn't quite understand what their role was meant to be. Get that all out the way up front, and then you can create a different version of that document for external partners. So coming back to your point, Paul, there might be some things you talk about internally that are a bit more commercially sensitive. You don't want that transparency, like media agencies, or 3PLs. but create a sanitized version of your brief to send to the external partners, so they've got at least the key information on the project and they can align their resource with it. And that leads into my second point, which is the race seat that I mentioned earlier. And that literally is the table of the different roles. You're not talking about the people. It's not listing every person. It's a role. So, for example, a role is a project manager. We need a project manager. The project manager's responsibilities are A, B, and C. Running the project charter, running project updates. Now, who do I assign to the project manager role? But you start with the roles and the responsibilities. And it's a really good way of getting discipline from the start, because you can very quickly map out all the project roles and then look at your existing stakeholders, who sits naturally with each of them. And then you can very quickly identify gaps you might have where you don't have the right skill set to fulfill a role. And then you have a very frank discussion about how you do that. Do you second somebody? Do you accept that skill set might not be in the project, and you look at what the risk is and you mitigate it? Or do you put money in from your project budget to bring in a contractor to fill that? So those are my starting points. What about you? What are some techniques that you advise for good communication, mate?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, I think that's a really good point around the RACI. Internal kickoff meeting calls is one that you've put here. I think that's really important. And I think they kind of referring back to one of the points you made originally, I think just making sure people are bought in and feel involved in a project can make a big difference and make them more willing to put time into things and take on deliverables or support when you're lacking resource, etc., etc. So I think that's a really important one. So you probably want a few different kickoff meetings involving a few different stakeholders, but I think that's always quite a nice way to start a project. And then you've put here as well, give stakeholders inputs before starting workshops. So I think that's always really good as well. So one, you're making people prepared and you're kind of giving them a lot more kind of context into the project. But recently we did a few documents and basically got some of the creative stakeholders from a brand to do a bit of homework, and that was quite a strategic move to try and get them a bit bought in, and basically also prepare some of the people that were doing the design work for their views and things like that. But anything like that, again, same principle, just getting people involved early on is just going to make them more likely to help and also get the most out of their time, etc.
Yeah, it's that kind of more is less principle. Give them more at the start, and then you can refine your approach to involvement as you learn more about who's best in which situations. I think those are the briefing things for any meetings internally. I have a simple maxim, and I encourage anyone to adopt, because I've seen too many businesses will arrange a meeting and people turn up with no bloody idea what they're there for. There's no structure to it, and there's no goals and outputs, and there's no one documenting it. So people come out not knowing what's going on. I've got a simple maxim, which is no meeting can go ahead without a clear goal and agenda, and therefore the people come into it know why they're there and what their contribution will be, and that there is an outcome that's targeted from that work. Now, you might not achieve the outcome. That's fine, because sometimes things become more complicated than you first expect, and you have to go to a second stage of analysis before you can wrap it up. But if you don't start with that structure, meetings become an absolute pain in the arse and waste of time, and you lose so much momentum in a project. I like, at least initially, until you work out the perfect cadence, is a weekly stand-up or call where there are notes from it, and this is really simple thing: is what's happened, what progress we made, what issues and we need to fix, and what's our priority for the week ahead. It's 4 simple agenda points, and then there are simple notes from it, and there are always actions that come out of this. And that's why you have to have somebody who owns the the note taking, the minutes, and circulation. That has to be clear, because otherwise you get 4 people in the meeting room, everyone goes off with slightly different views of what was agreed, and then nobody circulates anything, and then you go up to somebody 2 days later, oh, you're going to send out the notes? Oh, no, I thought you were. So that's critical. And I've done this recently. I did this during lockdown with a client where we ended up having 2 weekly stand-ups, because we had two sets of stakeholders, because they were in the offices, different offices and different times of the week, where we just said, sod it, we're going to suck up the project time because the communication is so important. And we did half-hour stand-ups. I think it's 30 minutes on a Tuesday and 30 minutes on a Wednesday, same stand-up to 2 different groups. And then we aligned the meeting notes, and we sent out 1 set of notes to every stakeholder in the project. It worked quite nicely. And then on larger projects, the other thing that I think people should consider is having a dedicated project engine room. So this is like, on a murder inquiry where they have the incident room, basically. A piece of the office that's dedicated to the project team, so that project team can be sat next to each other to make speaking to each other far quicker and more dynamic. Give them the space and give them whiteboards and meeting space so they've got that, so they don't have to scramble around when they need a critical urgent meeting and find out there's no meeting rooms available for 2 days. It's well worth it. This suits larger businesses, but ironically, actually, some of the businesses I've seen do this best are small startups without big teams, because they have office space that isn't being filled out yet. So,
what is Amplience? In a word, it's freedom. The freedom to build a digital experience as limitless as your vision. Create, preview, schedule, and manage all your content in one easy place. Find out more at amplience.com. Amplience. Experience freedom.
What else, from your point of view, makes good communication?
Yeah, that makes sense. And these two, again, feel slightly hypocritical, because I'm not amazing at these things, or there's areas we could be a lot stronger as a business. But yeah, kind of action logs. So this is something that I think I've definitely started to appreciate. So action log, prioritization, and then clear owners of tasks. This is something that I do a lot more of now. So historically I was quite scrappy, and like I said, I just kind of operate in isolation. But yeah, I think all of this stuff's really important. Even like minutes and notes from calls, all of that stuff. I think is really important. And that kind of action log, and sending maybe a weekly email just to kind of provide an insight into this stuff, I think is really important. And then escalation, so just having a clear escalation process, making it clear who the points of escalation are, and basically just having something down for that, for when that's needed. And I think that is really important.
I think that's really important, because I've seen projects where people haven't talked about escalation paths and who do things get escalated. And this is both in the client side to the sponsors, so that something can be unpicked if there's internal blockers, or it's to the third parties you're working with where a senior resource is needed. For example, you're working with an integration company and they're saying this isn't part of the scope and there's a disagreement and you need it fixed. So it's really important, because if you don't have clear escalation paths where decision making can be sorted, you end up with confrontation. And we both know once you start into negative confrontation, it's quite damaging to the relationship, and that can really be a really negative experience in the project. My last one on effective comms, and for everyone listening, I'm not saying but that I've exhausted all of the points you could make on good project communication, but it's documentation. It's so important, and there are different levels of documentation. So there are the project level documents that a project manager would run, like a project raid, for example, project updates. There's scoping documentation. The one that I think is missed in too many projects is an internal document that is a task tracker, basically. So a PM will have a full raid log, which will have all of the risks, actions, issues, and decisions. The everyday stakeholder doesn't need to have access and to see that. It's too much information. But what is really useful is to distill that into real simple. I've done this in Google Sheets, or protected Google Sheets, so many times. It's literally a replica of all of the actions that the internal business stakeholders have to take, with the priorities against them, with the deadlines, and with the summary of what they are, and with a status check. And then you just put these standard filters on. So, if Paul wants to filter it to only see his task, he just clicks on his filter and then he's only got his task. Really nice way of getting it all in one. And what you can then do is you add a summary sheet to it, which shows, add a lovely little pie chart, which does progress. And you can show week to week progress. Like last week, we're at 30% complete. This week at 58%. Big smiley face. Well done, team. Great progress. It's amazing how just simple visualization like that, when people are bogged down in the detail, when you hit your development phases and your early sprints, it can feel like an endless number of tasks being added on. And it can be really demotivating for people who aren't used to this, because all they see is shit in front of them, not like the blue skies. But then being told, well done, you've completed, you're 58% through versus 30%. It's amazing how it can just alleviate that feeling of pressure.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, visualizing progress. I think that's really important. And actually, even just keep some of the there's probably some extra points we could have made around like motivating people as well through these projects, because they can be like massive projects. And I think that's an interesting one, like across all teams, like motivation is really important. So the next one I've got, so what are the key ongoing updates through the project? So I guess the first one I've got is progress around development, and it's kind of like what you were saying there. I think just giving people, showing that there's progress being made. So you might have some like qualitative inputs there, but then also like a number or a percentage way through the project on that side. So I think that's really important, and that's kind of a broader update that you can give to a broader set of stakeholders. I think the internal deliverables, this is one of the biggest risks to a project, is making sure the internal teams are ready and actually do the work and are being held to account, etc. So I think just making sure that right from the start, you're just sending updates on expectations for internal deliverables from different stakeholders and members of the team. And then as you get to a certain point, maybe like halfway through the project, start talking about launch, start involving people in launch, making roles clear, making any changes to the scope clear, all of that kind of stuff. So I think that's really important. And then lastly, just any changes around processes as well. And what I actually meant by this was more like maybe it's like the merchandising team and, the platform actually really impacts how they do things from like a product or like production perspective. So just making that really clear early on, making sure you've kind of got sessions in, they're aware, they're not worried basically, because I think that's the other thing. You can get quite a lot of fear quite easily in re-platform projects unnecessarily, and regular comms and sessions can counter that really easily. Anything you'd add to that?
No, I think that you've summarised it nicely, because it's about change management. And I learned this years ago. I was working with House of Fraser on a big re-platforming, and they appointed a specialist change manager, and she was incredible. She taught me a lot about how businesses businesses underestimate the impact of change on the business. They focus on the technology project at the expense of the process and the training and the education, so that people can be ready both physically in terms of being able to do the job, but also mentally in terms of how they will execute it. So I think that's critical. And on smaller projects, you don't have a change manager, right? You don't have the luxury. Typically, that's done that's expected to be done either between the PM and the business lead, or the e-commerce lead, or by the e-commerce lead when you don't have a PM. And it's a lot. You realise the responsibility, but at least having the milestones again, well, actually, we're switching CMS. Okay, so we've got to have content management training. We will have an amazing new site without content if we don't get them prepared. And let's not leave it to the sites in staging. That's got to be started 3-4 months in advance. So I think that's absolutely critical. You're right. Knowing what your key elements are that are changing, and pre-planning those in advance so that people don't end up turning around going, we can't get this done. And I've seen sites 4 to 6 weeks late simply because content isn't ready. So I think there's nothing more I'd add. I think just anyone listening, talk about change management, and if you don't know what it means, go and research online. There's a lot of good articles about how to manage for change, and about how you need to identify the processes that are changing, and then look at the implications on your stakeholders and make sure they're educated on it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that brings us on to tooling, tech. What can you use to help with these comms? What's your take on it?
Yeah, so I mean, we typically use Asana for kind of task management, progress monitoring, all of that. And I think Asana has improved a lot over the last couple of years. I mean, obviously there's loads of other tools that do a very similar thing, but Asana's got particularly good for managing things like timelines and task dependencies and teams, and even like some of the documentation stuff that historically you might end up using something like Confluence with alongside Asana. I think it has got a lot better, and we've gradually moved more stuff into Asana and stuff away from Google Sheets, but we'd still use Google Sheets for a lot of stuff as well, just where certain stakeholders might prefer that, or it might be slightly better placed for the collaboration stuff. But yes, we'd use that, and then Slack for comms typically. But with all of these, there's so many different kind of options. But yeah, it's kind of what we've ended up working with. Yeah, so I put here, like, one of the benefits of using a tool like Asana is you can basically build a set of tasks, map those out against different groups of people, assign those out, put timelines in there, put the dependencies, everything else, and you can end up with a pretty decent Gantt chart, which can then be used for kind of internal comms, everything else, but also as like the master for the timeline. And that was something we've only recently started using, just because it just feels like something that's quite well placed for Excel and Google Sheets, but we've recently moved that over. I think the hardest thing with something like Asana is getting people to stick to it, because the main reason why it's great is because you've got that point of reference and you can refer back to conversations, and you can have sub conversations, etc. But it needs to be used fully in order to kind of add that value. And then the last thing I'd say is, quite often, so on our average project, an agency will have their tool stack. So that might be, so an agency we're working with at the minute use Basecamp for comms, and then they use Jira internally. So that's great, and I think the same principles apply, but then we would still have Asana for our internal deliverables and everything else. I think keeping those separate makes complete sense, just because you want to have such different stakeholders and such different levels of comms in the internal one. So yeah, I think that's always been beneficial to us.
Yeah, it's an interesting point you made about Asana and make sure that people have to stick to it. I fully agree. I think those tools, whether it's Asana or Monday or whatever you choose, ClickUp, there are so many different ones. Culturally, it's got to be prioritized, and that comes from the project sponsor down. I've seen it in brands that have spent a lot of money on licenses and nobody uses it. It's like a glorified turd polishing exercise where people set up this lovely looking dashboard and go, look, aren't we organized? But we're not organized because people aren't using it. They haven't been trained on it. And most of the stuff's still done by email. So the whole point of the task management flow is gone. And it's critical that you've got to get people, the culture's got to be there for people to buy in, and they've got to be told by the people who are their line managers that they need to buy into this process. Because if that doesn't happen from the start, it's game over. But I agree in principle, they're brilliant, and they simplify comms because of the alert management, and the over-reliance on email in projects still winds me up. I keep telling clients, it's going to end in tears. Someone will miss a key action. You'll forget it. Some external emails will end up in junk folders or not make it through. People will think they've communicated or they're being ignored. And it's, manage it far better. The only other thing I think I'd add, because I think you touched on it, you've got to just keep this simple, right? If you make the tooling and the collab tools that the support it so complex, people won't use them. But the one bit where you sometimes need to get a little bit more expansive is it on really large complex programs where you might have multiple sub-projects working toward an overall program. For example, you've got a CRM piece alongside an e-commerce, and there's an ERP integration flow, and you've got a proper project manager managing those interdependencies. Having a PMO or a project management office in those scenarios really adds value, where basically you have the central project team, you have all of the central project management, and normally that's where you get the project engine room I talked about earlier, and they will set the technology, and they might not need other people to use it, but they will have their set of tools for managing those projects and programs effectively, and then they will work with the wider stakeholder group to determine how that two-way flow of information. My summary on this is basically, it doesn't matter what tools you use, as long as you make the decision on merit. Like, do you know why you're using a tool and what problem it solves and how you're going to use it? Have you communicated to the people who you need to use it? And have they been motivated to use it? And also, do they know that they have to and it's not an optional thing? And then are they trained up? So can they easily use them, find stuff, edit, update, share, etc.? If you take that structured approach and make sure people are bought into the process, then I don't think the platform choice matters as much as actually just getting people using stuff.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Cool. So I feel like we've probably covered the core comments around what's the importance of comms and how to achieve good comms in e-commerce projects. What would be your parting thought?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one. I think it's just a case of probably you almost just need to plan this from the start and think about what could feasibly go wrong and just get it written down and almost have like a bit of a project plan around comms specifically. And then I think the other big one would be what we were just talking about there. If you are using a project tool, I think it can have a huge impact on how the project goes in terms of like, yeah, it being a smooth project, but like you say, only if everyone is bought in, because actually it can cause more problems. One of my bad habits is WhatsApp with clients. So quite often I'll be talking to people, making decisions like outside of working hours on WhatsApp, and actually things like that just ruin Asana completely. So yeah, I think it's that's a really important, or like, yeah, sticking to that tool and process is really important. Yeah, I think they're probably my main two.
Yeah, we're all guilty of it though, because in the heat of project pressure, especially when you've got concurrent projects, it's human nature to slack, and that's why good project managers basically whip people into shape by basically saying that's not good enough, sort it out. And I've had people tell me before, no, that was our project. You go, you're right, 100%. And it's really important to remind yourself of that discipline. So my parting thought is this. Is good communication basically means you've got a plan for what you want to share with whom and when. And it doesn't have to be perfect up front. You can finesse this. You can adapt as you progress to plug gaps. So you can increase and decrease your communication cadence as required. For example, on one project, I've moved from a weekly to a bi-weekly call to align with the sprints because the weekly call was just overkill. We didn't really have much to update on, and it was just a waste of 30 minutes of 7 or 8 people's time. So we sat that, went every 2 weeks, and it worked way more effectively. But with that said, I think more is better than less initially, because you can filter out. So you can take people off of meeting invites as you learn that actually that's not the best use of your time, and not everyone has to receive the same info. So just remember that what you communicate upwards to like senior stakeholders, investors, is a sanitized version of the detailed project update. So think about what people need to act and base the information you give to them accordingly. Cool. Hopefully that's been useful. We've had a good half an hour rant at you. Any questions, as always, do reach out. Anything you think we've missed, any obvious tips for good communication in e-commerce technology projects, let us know. We'd love to hear it. But thanks for listening. Keep an ear open for the next episode. They drop every Tuesday. And do subscribe. It makes us feel very happy. And we'd love a like on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube. Thanks very much. For more information on this topic, head over to replatform.fm for our audio podcasts. To discuss a project, or if you'd like to chat about any of the topics covered in this episode in more detail, please reach out to myself, James Gurd, or my co-host Paul Rogers via LinkedIn and Twitter. Thanks again for listening, and keep your ears peeled for the next episode.